Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at two very closely related subjects, automation and quick controls. Quick controls are a means by which we can bundle together various different automation commands to perform effectively kind of macro level control of Halion. Hope you're enjoying this series so far, and if you are, please check out my Patreon and channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. Now then, just before we have a look at how automation is employed in Halion, I'm going to jump over to another instrument. Here's a plugin by Arturia. This is the Farfisa organ. And if we drill into the automation lanes for Farfisa, you'll see they're all very nicely labeled. You can see all of the functions of the plugin. This is basically what you'll most commonly see. This is the norm for most VST plugins. You'll see a list of automation. You could assign any of these automation lanes inside Cubase, write automation, and you're going to get the job done. Very different situation with Halion though. If we have a look at how Halion implements automation, we drill into the same equivalent area in Cubase, get a completely different view. Firstly, we have these 64 slots, and this obviously corresponds to the slots that we can have inside Halion itself, and at the moment I have a default program with just slot 1 populated. So if we have a look in slot 1, what do we see? Well, a very small and disappointingly sparse list. Where are all my filters? Where are all of my envelope settings? Let's have a look a little bit further down. There's an automation folder underneath. What's in there? Again, a very disappointing and boring generic list of 512 completely empty channels. So where is it all? Well, the answer is that in Halion, nothing is given to you for free. There are so many functions in Halion, and it's possible to create such dynamic and flexible programs that it's impossible to even anticipate how many automation lanes you're going to be. It's entirely dependent on how many layers and instruments you add inside your program. And so what you need to do in Halion is manually define which functions inside your program you want to be automated. So let's have a look at how we go about that. Here I've got a simple analog synth. I've created a single sawtooth oscillator and activated the filter section. I'm going to right click on the cutoff knob. Now there are two different ways that we can create, and I'll put air quotes around this word, automation. There are two different means by which you can communicate with plugins. The old world method, and this has been around for 40 odd years, is by using the MIDI protocol. Pretty much every piece of hardware that's been invented since the early 80s has had the capacity to communicate via MIDI, and most VST plugins can talk that language as well. So if I right click the cutoff knob, I can have it enter learn CC mode. CC stands for continuous controller. It's basically like a section of the MIDI protocol that's assigned, dedicated to these communication channels with hardware. So if I put it in learn CC mode and then turn a physical controller on my hardware, so the controller I'm about to move is mapped to CC data 22, and that's it. That's all I had to do, just move the knob. Now when I return to the cutoff control, you can see assigned to port A channel 1, controller 22. So now my hardware is connected to Halion. Every time I turn this control, it's going to do the job. If I press record, I'll be able to record CC data into the track. Now CC data is not automation data, they're not the same. Automation is effectively an evolution of the concept of CC data, and it provides a much closer communication protocol with the two devices that allow effectively a two-way communication and is in almost every way superior. Basically what CC data's got going for it is its generic nature. All instruments talk the same language, so if you need something that is completely across the board and will connect to a different keyboard, if you connect, a separate, buy a new keyboard and plug it in, CC data is much more generic. Having said that, I'm going to throw it away and we're not going to talk about it again today. I want to focus more specifically on automation. So now I'm going to make it forget that CC data. This time I'm going to subscribe my filter cutoff control to an automation lane instead. Let's right click, and instead of saying learn CC this time, I'm going to say assign to new automation. Now let's go back into Cubase and see what it looks like from the automation perspective in here. Here's our first populated automation lane. Take a very careful look at this name. It's really important. Analog synth is the name of the program. It prefixes the function that's been assigned to it. And when I was setting up for this video, after creating my init synth, I renamed the program and the layer to make a very obvious difference between a program level and layer level. As we go on through this video, you're going to see that this is critically important in understanding how automation works. You've got to get your labels between layers and programs right, because as I'm going to show you, you can actually create automation inside individual layers. We now have an active automation lane connecting Halion's filter cutoff to Cubase. Get rid of that Farfisa instrument, we don't need to see it anymore. I'm going to create a new automation lane. Simply single click on Analog Synth, say OK. Here's the automation lane. Now I can draw in automation on that track. And when I press play, watch the filter cutoff control. It's reading this automation and doing whatever it's been told to do. One of the advantages of automation is that everything is well named. It's really easy to see what's going on. It's also a two-way communication device. Halion and Cubase can speak to each other perfectly fluently on this automation channel. So far so good, that's pretty straightforward. The next thing that I want to do is create a second layer. I'm going to duplicate the saw layer by copy, right click on the program, paste, and I'm going to rename the second layer square layer. I couldn't sleep if I didn't rename the zone and bus as well. Let's just quickly do that. I'll set my oscillator type of the square layer to square PWM. Now I want to set the filter cutoff for the square layer different to the saw layer. You can see at the moment they both have the same cutoff frequency, 1616. I want to change the square layer. I'm going to pull the cutoff down. I'm going to let go of the mouse. It pings back. Because I created automation on this lane, and the automation is operating at the program level, every layer inside this program is responding to this automation. So I can't manually change this square cutoff. So I want to decouple this automation. I don't want it to operate on everything. When I created this automation in this lane, I only ever intended it to operate on the saw layer, and now it's effectively no longer fit for purpose. Now, it's really important when dealing with automation to maintain real clarity of thought, understand exactly what it is you're trying to do, because if you leave kind of automation lying around in the background, it can just cause unnecessary trouble. If I right click, remove selected track to throw all of this automation away and pull my cutoff control back, now it works. I've got control back again because there's no longer automation inside Cubase kind of forcing this control to change. However, the automation that I created at the saw layer, which kind of accidentally propagated up to the program level, is still there. We have a look at the saw layer and right click on the cutoff knob. You can see that all of that information is still there. Here I am still in the square layer. If I right click on the cutoff knob, you can see that it is still assigned to an automation lane, and I don't want it to be. So I'm going to get rid of this automation. I can simply say forget, and now it's gone. I want to prove that it's gone. Does Halion remember any of the automation mappings I've created so far? I jump over to the Auto CC tab, and this screen is empty, which basically says there are no automation mappings. Excellent, back over to the zone. So the next thing I want to do is to create independent automation connections, one for the saw layer, one for the square layer. Can I do that? Well, the answer is yes. Here I am currently selected on the square layer, so we'll start there. Right click, assign to new automation. And now it says square layer filter cutoff. This is why your naming conventions are so important. This automation is only operating on a single layer, and that's exactly what I want. So I'll click on the automation lane, say OK, and let's create some automation, and I'll kind of use shapes to describe the different automation as I'm going on. So there's my square automation. Press the play on the track, and there's the cutoff pinging backwards and forwards in a very arbitrary manner. Let's have a look at the sawtooth layer. No automation at all. Next step, let's create some automation for the saw layer. I've got it selected, so that's good. Right click. I'm going to create a brand new automation lane. I do not want to add my saw layer connection to the existing automation lane. This here, square layer, is automation lane number 1 in Cubase. I want to add new automation to automation lane number 2. And now in Cubase, I'll create myself a new automation lane. Map it to channel 2. Saw layer filter cutoff, great stuff. And this time we'll draw a sawtooth wave. So when we press play on the song, here's our saw layer. And when we jump over to the square layer, it's bouncing backwards and forwards, responding to its automation track. So this is exactly what we want automation to do. We want that direct communication between Cubase and Halion, but it's user-defined, just unlike the Farfisa, the Arturia Farfisa, that gave you every automation control immediately, because effectively it's a fixed environment. The Farfisa is what it is. You don't get to add modules in the same way that you can with Halion. Halion, you have to define your own because it's a much more flexible environment. Now, the ability to create automation at both the program and the layer level can cause trouble. To demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is go back up to my saw layer. I'm going to remove the automation, forget automation for the saw layer. Have a look at this interface very carefully. I'm going to select analog synth. Absolutely nothing has changed because the saw layer is the first layer inside the analog synth program, so it doesn't look like there's any change at all. It's really easy to inadvertently right click on this control. I mean, the lights are turning red. Halion's already telling you that, are you sure you want to do the thing that you're about to do? If we right click and assign this command to automate what we think is the saw layer, what we've actually just done there is created a program level automation. And here's an issue with the integration with the Cubase environment. If we hover over this control, it still says saw layer, filter cutoff. The interface, Cubase interface, doesn't automatically rename all of its automation lanes. We actually drill into the automation folders and scroll down. There isn't an automation lane called saw layer, but Cubase still thinks there is. Well, basically when we created this automation lane, it got given this kind of arbitrary text label. What I'm going to do is remove this track, and I'm going to add back in the new automation lane that I just created. Let's try assigning something to the saw layer. But of course, we don't have saw layer control anymore. We only have analog synth control. So if I redraw my sawtooth line, if we have a look at the saw layer, it's going to look like everything is absolutely fine. There's the cutoff going down diagonally according to the slope that I've just drawn. The problem is when we jump over to the square layer, which is supposed to be bouncing backwards and forwards doing its square shape, it isn't. The program automation has overridden the layer level information. So you need to be very careful if you're creating automation at multiple levels of a hierarchy. What is it you're actually trying to do? Are you making life just too complicated for yourself? I'm going to make all that unpleasantness go away. I'll remove this automation and I'm going to reassign it back to the saw layer, which is where I really want it to be. A single click on saw layer, right click on my cutoff, assign to new automation. This automation lane in Cubase is kind of broken. Even if I went back in and tried to reassign it to automation lane number 2, it's not going to work. It's actually easier just to throw the track away and rebuild it from scratch. It's ugly, I'm not happy about it either, but it is the way it is. Create the saw layer and redraw my diagonal line. Okay, so we're back where we were with the saw layer responding to the cutoff, and the square layer is going to be bouncing backwards and forwards as I want it to. Let's jump over to the automation section and see what we can see over there. And sure enough, here are the two automation assignments exactly as we'd expect to see. Let's try assigning multiple controls to the same automation lane. I right click on the resonance knob. Instead of assigning it to new automation, this time I'm going to add it to an existing automation lane. This is the square layer, so I'm going to assign it to the square layer filter cutoff. Now the problem with doing it this way is that this name is not going to be sensible anymore. Filter cutoff is very specific to a single control. I've now added a second automation control to the same automation lane. When I press play, both controls map exactly as I would expect them to. It's the square layer. So now the cutoff and resonance are bouncing backwards and forwards. So automation lane number 1, which is where we're interacting with the square layer filter, is now misnamed. Jump back over to the automation tab And here we can see square layer filter cutoff. That doesn't make any sense anymore. So we'll just call it square layer filter instead. So it's possible to assign any number of controls all to the same lane. Just think of it as 512 individual communication channels. Any control inside Halion can subscribe to one of those channels. When they receive a command from Cubase, all of the controls will respond to it simultaneously. Now there's a problem with that. All controls will respond simultaneously. They'll do exactly the same job. Both of these knobs are doing exactly the same thing as the song plays. They're tracking in an identical manner. Well, what happens if we want to maintain a little bit more control than that? At the moment, it's just this arbitrary hardwiring connection between the automation lane and anything that subscribes to it. This is where we introduce quick controls. Quick controls provide a handshake mechanism between the outside world, Cubase, the hardware, whatever it is that's communicating with Halion, and the controls inside Halion themselves. Quick controls allow us to provide basically a mapping mechanism between those two entities. So let's have a look at those next. First thing that I'm going to do is forget the automation on the resonance control. So here's my brief. This is what I want to do. I want a single control on my keyboard. I want to be able to adjust both the saw filter cutoff and the square filter cutoff simultaneously from a single control. I don't want to do it via automation lanes because, as I just said, that's going to provide this hardwired mechanism. I want to maintain complete control of how much those two filter cutoffs are adjusted when I turn the knob on my keyboard, and I'm going to do it with quick controls. So this is how we do it. I'm going to select the saw layer to start with. Here's my filter cutoff for the saw layer. At the bottom of the interface, we have these 8 very unassuming controls. These are our quick controls. They're not currently assigned to anything. They're not doing anything. I'm going to map one of these quick controls to the filter cutoff. I'm going to right click on the filter cutoff, assign quick control, and I want to keep it inside the saw layer. As you'll see very shortly, this is step 1 in a 2-step process. I need to set up the quick controls inside the layer and then basically propagate that information up the chain. So here I am assigning the saw cutoff to QC1, and immediately the label renames to filter cutoff. Now that's the quick control assigned, and you might think that I can turn my control in Cubase and have everything work, but unfortunately that's not true. This quick control needs to be treated like any other automation parameter. It's a control that I need to be able to communicate with from Cubase, and so I need to assign that quick control to an automation lane. That's very easy to do. I simply right click on the control, add to automation. I'm going to rename this QC, saw filter quick control. Make it absolutely clear what's going on at every stage of the process. I can't stress this enough. Labeling is absolutely critical. Now I can map this quick control into Cubase. I haven't actually finished the job yet. I'm just going to do this as a temporary measure. I need to make sure that the instance of Halion has focus. Engage learn mode on my track quick controls. Now when I move this control inside the Halion interface, it's going to be mapped into the quick controls, and as you can see, saw layer, saw filter QC. So that's it now. I've got control of that parameter from I'm moving QC knob number 1 on my keyboard, quick control number 1, and there it is. Let's go back to a clean slate with our automation lanes. And now I'm going to start interacting with the quick controls rather than with the direct automation parameters. I've created this buffer. I want to start using it. So let's see what automation lanes are available to us. Well, obviously there are 3 of them. I want to assign automation to my quick control. Labeling is king. And now when I draw my sawtooth, it's the quick control that's operating. If I just hold a note down on my keyboard, so the filter is working. The filter control doesn't seem as if it's responding, but the quick control is. If I hover over this quick control, you can actually see that you get a dynamic update. You can see the filter number, the cutoff frequency, modulating as the quick control is moved. So this direct connection does exist, but because the quick control is a relative control, basically applying a mask to the master filter cutoff, which by default is set at 0. But that's not satisfied the brief. I want to control both of these filters simultaneously. I'm going to jump over to my square layer. and I'm going to perform exactly the same process. Right click on the cutoff, assign quick control. This time I'm going into the square layer and I'm going to assign it to QC1. Square filter QC. And now we've got a problem, haven't we? If I assign this QC to automation as well, how am I performing both of those operations at the same time? How am I using a single control on my keyboard to change these two quick control values simultaneously? I need to go through this extra step of connecting those two quick controls together, and that's where I use the program. The program has the mechanism for seeing all of these quick controls simultaneously. Again, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to throw this automation lane away. Just keep everything clean, prevent Cubase from getting upset. Now I'm going to jump up to the program level. Can you see all of the quick controls are completely blank? There are no program level quick controls yet. Now we can complete the last stage of the process. Each of the quick controls that I've assigned, don't forget these could be performing multiple operations. These quick controls could be changing any number of commands inside the filter bank. I'm just using kind of single instance examples for the sake of simplicity. This saw layer quick control is now going to get propagated up one level, up to the master quick control, the program level quick control. So analog synth is grayed out because that's the name of the program, and we assign it to QC1. Go into the square layer, do exactly the same, assign this to QC1. You see it's called saw filter. I'm going to fix that. Basically, the first thing that you assign automation to gets the default name. But of course, when we jump up to the program level, we now have the opportunity to rename this, and we're going to call it analog filter QC. Now, program level quick controls are implicitly mapped into Cubase. Do you remember right at the beginning of the episode when we had a look at our automation options? In each of the slots, there were kind of some pre-built things, and I said that's a very small and disappointing list. Here are the quick controls for the program, and you can see QC1, analog filter QC. There's the manual name that I gave that quick control. And so if I re-engage learn mode on the track quick controls and move the program quick control, we've just reassigned quick control number 1 to where we want it to be. Let's prove that both of those mappings have propagated. I'll mute the square layer so we can only hear the saw. There's the cutoff. The square layer physical cutoff is actually set to maximum, so I'm just going to give myself some headroom. There we go. Resonance was set to maximum and sounding a little bit crazy. When I turn this knob on my keyboard, I'm not directly communicating with the square layer filter cutoff. I'm communicating with the quick control, and that's routing that information through to the cutoff. Now, there's no getting around it. When you introduce quick controls and you start assigning multiple parameters to them like this, it's just a complex process. You know, there's a lot to remember here. You do get some assistance in this regard. If we select the top level program node and jump over to the sound tab, we have a section called quick control assignments. And in here, you can see, here's my master analog filter quick control, and you can see all of the assignments for it. This is where we can set the minimum and maximum levels. Remember when I said quick controls were relative? Well, we've got complete control of what those relative values are. So we can change our minimums and maximums. I can do it from the text boxes themselves, or I can pick up these little arrows that allow me to set the minimum and maximum range. You can pick up the lines to generate exponential and logarithmic transitions between these automations. And of course, we've completely decoupled the quick control from the parameter itself. So now I could, for instance, have a much more subtle curve for the square layer modulation than for the sawtooth layer, and the quick controls will take care of those mappings. There is no denying automation and quick controls in Halion is a complex and difficult subject. All I can suggest is that you baby step your way into it and you don't try to create automation connections that are too complex, particularly if you have multiple hierarchical connections between programs and layers. It's really easy to start falling over yourself. You've got all of these different relative values that are stacking on top of each other. For instance, in this case, I've got a quick control now at the master program level, but inside each of these layers, I also have a completely independent quick control that's also applying a relative offset to the fundamental control right down at the heart of it. And even that has the capacity to be manually manipulated. So that's an awful lot of relative offsets to remember. I suggest you start off simple, play with single layer programs, get an idea for how automation and quick control works. And then when you've got the concepts under your fingers, introduce multiple layers and start figuring out how quick controls can basically be combined to create effectively macros. Cup of tea is very much in order for me. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.